Yeah. The chap known as Bond is somebody else entirely. He wishes, you know. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tearing yourselves away from your breakfasts and coming along to see me. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to have you here. So, Russ, thank you for those kind words. Yeah, so I am a Falkland Islander. I usually say that I'm probably the only Falkland Islander you'll meet, but in about 10 days, no, less than that. Anyway, however many days, we'll be in the Falklands, fingers crossed. And you'll probably meet a load more Falkland Islanders, plus hundreds of thousands of penguins. So yeah, I was born in the Falklands, still go back there often. It was my good fortune or misfortune, I'm still not entirely sure which, that I was there in April 1982 when the Argentines invaded. On balance, I'm glad I was. I wish it had never happened, but I'm glad I was there. So there wasn't, under occupation, there really was not much possibility, if any, to really do any local journalism. Most of the people in Port Stanley had gone to the relative safety of the camp, of the farms, although we'll come on to that later. And in any case, the Argentines made it very clear to me very early on they didn't even want a local newspaper published. So I decided that I would make it my duty to record what was going on. I was a very keen photographer at the time. And just now, you saw an image of the actual cameras that I used in '82. My friend Peter and I had a dark room, which many slightly sort of sad young men would in those days. We'd process and print our own pictures. And so it was natural for me to wield my camera and get as many pictures as I could. During the early days, quite openly, because the Argentines were not terribly concerned about what they'd done. They were quite full of themselves, in fact, felt no sense of security, or they felt a great sense of security, rather, and the war had not yet broken out and given them time to regret what they'd done. After that, life became difficult, and so some of them are taken in a slightly in an open way, others are taken in a hidden way, and you'll be able to see, I think, those which were taken from, behind curtains or something like that. So, yeah, that's me in 1982, shortly after all of the guns fell silent and leaning against an Argentine artillery piece. And that's me 40 years later, sans beard, still with some hair. 3 years on, I've lost my hair as well. So things seem to accelerate, don't they, as you get a bit older. So when the 40th anniversary was approaching, I decided that I would dust off my old photographs and create an exhibition, both in Stanley at the museum. Go and visit the museum, by the way, it's excellent. And also at the historic dockyard in Chatham, England, where many of the ships from the 1982 task force came and went and were based. So they were very happy to show my exhibition of photos as well. So a little orientation here. They do say that in the British Army, the most dangerous thing known to man is an officer with a map. So apologies to General Nick Halley for that, but they do say that in the British Army. I'm just hoping that it's not axiomatic of cruise ship lecturers as well. But I think a couple of maps will help us to orientate ourselves. So you can see that the Falklands are rather nestled in the beckoning finger of Argentina and, for that matter, Chile. And we are very close. What I haven't shown, because I'd need a screen about 50 feet high, is the distance from the UK. But there we are. Back in those days, our principal route for communication was between Comodoro Rivadavia on the Argentine coast and Stanley. So, hang on a second, sorry, I pressed the wrong button there. Let's see if we can get back on course. Just bear with me. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, we had communications by air with Comodoro Rivadavia and Stanley down there, a 2.5 to 3 hour flight. The Falklands themselves, Stanley over here on the far east side, quite a good sheltered harbour, which was why it was established back in 1843 by one of my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, among others. And other names that you will be perhaps familiar with from the War of '82, Fitzroy there, Goose Green there, Port San Carlos up here, and all those names came to be known very well. So that's some idea of how the Falklands look and where they're situated. So a little background, it genuinely did seem like the Falklands were forgotten by the world. They were certainly not remembered particularly strongly or loved particularly by the mother country, by Great Britain. And we were pretty happy with that. We were quite happy to go on with our fairly rustic and quiet, peaceful way of life. Sheep farming was the only business that really mattered. And of course, we were surrounded by beautiful wildlife. And that was, I have to say, a little bit dull for a newspaper editor. I think I hankered off after some news. But you know, in those days, perhaps the most exciting thing generally to happen would be the annual flower and home produce show, which was very important to my father, but frankly, it bored the bejesus out of me. So here we were in the years leading up to 1982. The Argentines were saying, "Come hither." And the British were saying, yeah, why don't you? Let's push you a bit. So for almost 150 years, we'd been a loyal British colony. And notwithstanding the loyalty, here was the government in London pushing us towards Argentina for economic support. So in fairly short order, there were agreements between London and Buenos Aires to supply the Falklands with gas for fuel. We'd survived on peat for that long. We didn't see why we couldn't continue with peat, but apparently gas was a good thing. And to provide us with petrol. So the two state companies, YPF and Gas del Estado, soon had a representation in the Falklands. And bizarrely, the Argentine Air Force were operating a twice-weekly flight into the Falkland Islands using these relatively small Fokker aircraft. And that lasted for about 8 years. And I mean, if I'm absolutely objective, I'd say that socioeconomic proximity to Argentina was not an entirely bad thing. At least we were cooperating. You know, tourists were coming in, we were talking a bit, we were getting to know each other. But the problem really was one of expectation management. The Argentines felt that they were getting a stronger grip all the time over the Falklands. We weren't happy because we knew that the stronger their grip, the more they could tighten it, which was exactly what they did. In the months leading up to 1982 and the invasion, the twice-weekly Argentine Air Force passenger flight was reduced to once weekly. Mail was very hit or miss, so some weeks we would go without any mail completely. Petrol started rising inexplicably, and we just felt that the screws were being tightened on us, and the pressure was on us even greater from Argentina and from Britain to say, okay, let's just sign over our lives to Argentina. But that was never going to happen. So I wonder how many, I think everybody is of an age really where we can remember perhaps even where we were and what we were doing when we heard that the Falklands had been invaded. I suspect certainly Brits can. Maybe a show of hands. Who can remember that moment or that day at least? Yeah. Quite a few. It was one of those moments. And of course, it was absolutely massive for us. This was a bit like, and this is a cultural reference for Brits, this was a bit like Ambridge and the Archers being invaded, you know, by a foreign power, and a not particularly nice foreign power either. Not that I have anything against your average Argentine, but at the time, the junta that was in power was extremely dangerous, extremely ruthless. And I perhaps was more aware of this than anybody else, because running the newspaper, I had a reciprocal arrangement with an English language newspaper in Buenos Aires. And I was keeping very closely up to date on the human rights abuses that were going on in Argentina. And frankly, I was scared. some of my compatriots, I think, were blissfully ignorant. And that was quite a good state to be in. But the thought that we might be invaded by a regime that was capable of disappearing its own people up to the tune of 30,000 and torturing and throwing them out of aircraft worried me just a little bit. About early on the morning of the 2nd of April 1982, the Argentines landed. And back in Britain, even the Foreign Office, which was supposedly in close contact with our Governor Rex Hunt at Government House, didn't know what had happened. So the first news to get out of the Falklands was by that tried and tested method, the radio ham. I don't even know if they still exist, but the amateur radio operators in time of crisis the world over back in the day were always good for getting word out. So the BBC managed to pick up a signal from a chap I know well in the Falklands still, a chap called Bob, who's, I believe, still operating his radio set. He was sending a message out, VP8 LP, we are being invaded, and the message was picked up. So this is, again, just a little in danger of a cruise ship lecturer in charge of a map is obvious, but just again to tell you a little bit about what happened that day on the 2nd of April. So the night before, about 7:30, we were informed over the local radio with a personal message from the governor that if all went well or badly, if the weather held, the Argentine invasion fleet could be expected to be, oh goodness, sorry, this is a new control to me, so I'm going to go back a bit again. Yeah. So the Argentine invasion fleet could be expected to be in Port William here, which, by the way, is the port we'll be anchoring in. And they would be landing in York Bay here, which we'll see. Okay. A joke's a joke, but it stops here. Right, let's try again. So the main Argentine landing force would be landing there. They would take the airport. This was pretty logical. We knew they would do that. And Rex Hunt, the governor, said he was mobilizing the Royal Marines, of which we had 80 defending the islands, against a force of an estimated probably 3,000 or 4,000 or possibly more. I'm not exactly sure how many people on the Argentine side landed. And we had about 40 of the defense force, our local militia, essentially. Normally, we would only have 40 Royal Marines defending the islands, but it just so happened that they changed over at that time. So the ship that bought them had dropped the new 40, and they were about to take the earlier 40 away. So we had 80 Marines, but only with enough weapons for 40. So that was a bit of a problem. So the Marines immediately took over the Defense Force HQ and ransacked the armory and took all the good weapons there, leaving the 40 or so local people of the militia with, and I kid you not, First World War vintage weapons. These were Lee Enfield rifles. And one water-cooled machine gun, which wasn't even rifled from modern ammunition. So that was not an auspicious start. The whole principle really behind the defense of the islands, if one could say there really was a defense, was that it was a tripwire. The Argentines were supposed to be smart enough to realize if you had the Marines and the defense force firing their weapons, then you could be fairly sure that the other end of the tripwire would move and something nasty would happen in London, which indeed it did. So, you know, overwhelming the defenses of the Falklands at that point wasn't going to be particularly difficult, although it was more difficult than the Argentines expected. So the Argentines had a submarine as well, a former American World War II submarine. They landed spearhead troops there and there to the south of Stanley, and their job was to make their way up to the Royal Marines barracks at that point in Moody Brook, and also directly to Government House, which was the symbolic center of British rule. Government House had to be taken, otherwise the flag would continue flying. This is all a bit primitive in my mind, but symbolism apparently is important in such circumstances. What they didn't know was that the Marines had vacated their barracks the night before and were in defensive positions around the town. And what they also hadn't reckoned on was trying to cross Falklands terrain. You'll get a little taste of that, perhaps, if you go off for a day excursion in Stanley. It is absolutely terrible countryside to walk over. And they were badly delayed reaching Moody Brook, and it was pointless anyway. Nevertheless, they threw grenades through the windows and pretty much destroyed it. And they managed to make it to Government House. The Marines themselves were on this area here, conducting a fighting withdrawal along this road here to the entrance to Stanley. And you have to remember that really this is a very, very tiny town. You will appreciate that, but we're not talking about either of the towns that we've seen in the last couple of days, which are not big. We're talking about something a tenth of that size. So the Argentines were held off at that point there, and they were coming in strength at this point. They had disembarked these heavy amphibious armored troop carriers in York Bay, and they were just trundling straight up towards Stanley. And as we saw them, it felt like that scene in War of the Worlds when people were seeing things they couldn't believe but were utterly terrifying. And they were advancing, and nothing seemed to be able to stop them. But at the entrance to Stanley, the Royal Marines did manage to disable one or two of them using man-carried anti-armor rocket launchers, 66mm ones for those who care. But they certainly didn't destroy or kill the troops inside. They just disabled them. So we're really on to my photographs now. And I was in the Upland Goose Hotel, the only hotel in Stanley which was run by my dear friends, the King family. And so I took some shelter there and did my best to record what was happening around me. So these massive American Amtraks were making their way up to Government House, where the Argentines were having trouble because the Marines had regrouped there, and they were fighting them off. But as soon as these Amtraks, these huge vehicles, arrived at Government House, it was quite clear that the game was up, that nobody could really fight them. They had heavy machine guns, and if necessary, they could flatten Government House. So by about 9 o'clock in the morning, the Argentine flag, right. The Argentine flag was flying over Stanley, and we knew that our world had changed utterly, and we didn't really know what was going to happen. That's my Auntie Maud's house down there, and I was taking it from my bedroom window. But for the time being, at least, the Argentines were in control. And they immediately started flying their occupation troops in. Their crack people had done a pretty good job. I was quite interested to hear the general describing the military operation the other day, the Russian military operation in Ukraine, as very, very badly planned, and even I could see that when he explained it. But I have a grudging respect for the Argentine plans. It seemed to me that it wasn't a bad plan. Plans, never survive first contact with the enemy, I think they say, but nevertheless, it wasn't a bad plan. And up until this stage, everything was going more or less as they expected. Casualties had been very, very low. Nobody died on the British side or on our side, although everybody was expecting the worst. Just one Argentine, a Commander Giacchino of the Argentine Navy, had been shot at Government House and died, and several others were wounded, although the Marines believed they'd killed and wounded a lot more, but that's usually the way it goes. So now they'd captured Stanley Airport, and they were pouring troops. Ironically, I'd flown in that aircraft a number of times, but as it came in that day, I was out with my cameras and I managed to capture it. on film. And their troops were following in the footsteps of the more professional guys. These were all conscripts, really, and we could see from day one that they didn't look like experienced or particularly well-trained or equipped troops. And that, from our point of view, I suppose, was a good thing. I remember the NCO there. He was not happy at all that I was taking pictures of his men, and he unleashed a barrage of Castilian obscenities at me. At which point I put the camera away, to be fair. So we were still in a state of shock. These Panhard armored cars were patrolling the streets of Stanley. The Argentines had issued a lot of edicts informing us that we had to pay due respect to Argentine national symbols, that there could be no verbal or physical abuse of any Argentine, and so on and so forth. It was quite clear that they were impressing their thumb very firmly. And for the first day or so, anybody leaving a building had to do so with a white flag. And so their first intention was to make it quite clear that we were under occupation. And they were there in overwhelming force. The Marines and Governor Hunt had been flown out of the Falklands by this time, and the Argentines, who were keen not to make the situation any more dangerous to them than it already was, were starting to go a little easier. Again, I would credit their intelligence about this. They decided that in as much as possible, they would not dismantle the organization of the islands. Instead, they would put their own people in, and they appealed for people to carry on as normal, to go to work, and to try and keep the small infrastructure of the islands working. That worked to a certain extent. I think in some government departments, it was decided that pragmatism suggested somebody had to keep control, for example, of the treasury. Somebody had to keep control of the banknotes and the accounts and that kind of thing. So skeleton crews of local people continued to operate. Others said, no way, I'm just not having anything to do with it. And they refused to work and so on. But again, it became quite clear to us that these troops were on the whole very ill-trained and very young. And we were not really afraid of these guys. For the first 3 weeks or so of the war, it was very much a phony war. The Argentine administrators were quite keen to have us on side if at all possible. That technique didn't work terribly well, but it was only about the 30th of April when everything changed. At that point, the RAF managed to bomb Stanley Airport, and I was looking at my diary for that day, and I was awoken extremely rudely about 5 a.m. when I thought the building, we never had earthquakes in the Falklands, but my first thought was we were having an earthquake. But in fact, what it was an RAF Vulcan bomber had just deposited a huge string of 1,000-pound bombs about 2 miles away on Stanley Airport. The idea being to break off one end of the communications line between the Argentine mainland and the Falklands. It didn't work terribly well. At that point, though, the Argentines in the Falklands knew that the game was up. They'd precipitated a war, and they put themselves on a different footing. And that applied to us as well. So on that particular day, the Argentine military police and intelligence went around rounding up our elected representatives, because we had a council and we had a democracy of sorts. And so all of the elected councillors, plus a few who were active in local politics, were arrested and taken off we knew not where. A couple of others were deported to Argentina. They were all legislators. They were all people who were the community leaders. They were sent off to Argentina, and thence we later learned on to Uruguay and to Britain. But it suddenly became very scary indeed. And the arbitrary arrests began and interrogations. And on that day, or it could have been the next day, the 1st, I think, 1st of May, they raided, a squad of troops raided the house of my friend Peter, where we had our dark room. Peter had been told that they were doing this, saw them coming, and went upstairs to our dark room and destroyed many of the prints that we had and even the negatives. I think he threw them into the peat fire because we weren't exactly spying because we had no means of getting the intelligence out, but we were enjoying the opportunity to record what we were seeing. But they looked pretty incriminating. And so many of the photographs I never saw again, but when the squad of Argentines came to the darkroom, they found some more innocent pictures, and they found some evidence that I was there as well, but they departed without taking anything with them. But the next day I was arrested and taken to their combined intelligence and military police station, and given a dressing down, really. I was nervous, but I was also curious. I didn't feel... We'd been lulled into something of sense of safety for the previous 3 weeks, and I didn't think they were really going to get horrendously nasty with me. And so all I had was a shouting at with a pistol on the desk, and they kept on asking me questions which I couldn't answer very well, and they were getting a little irritated, and voices were beginning to be raised, at which point an officer opened the door and he said, "Tranquilo, tranquilo, okay, let's all," he said, "let's all calm down," in Spanish. "Un cigarrillo, señor, quiere un cigarrillo," said. And I didn't smoke. For some obscure reason, which is completely unfathomable, I said, "Yes, please." And they were, if anybody's been to Argentina, I don't know if they still make them, but they have a cigarette called the Jockey Club. And the Jockey Club, it struck me later, was probably made from the sweepings from the stable floor rather than anything else. And I inhaled deeply because I felt I should, and I just exploded in a fit of coughing, which took about 5 minutes to get over. And after the first 3 minutes or so, they were actually starting to smile. And I think they thought this guy is a complete idiot. And so I was ordered to come back within a couple of days with evidence that I was in fact producing a newspaper, a little newspaper, and to prove that I had a reason to be taking photographs. They were very keen that for me to prove that I had that good reason. The following day, the same office, the intelligence and the military police office, was hit by a British missile, which pleased me greatly. And I didn't return. So I don't know if their records were also destroyed, but that was the end of my encounters with Argentine intelligence, fortunately. The Falklands weather for much of the time, by the way, I am jumping ahead because I'm really basing this on my personal story, not on the campaign as such. But the weather, generally speaking, during that winter of 1982 was not bad. The media in the UK painted it as terrible weather conditions, but to us it wasn't a particularly bad winter, but it did get a little bit worse as we went on. So by the time this was snapped, some nasty winter weather had caught up with us. The British had landed in San Carlos. They paid a terrible price for that. 4 warships, 2 frigates and 2 destroyers had been sunk by the Argentine Air Force as they tried to disembark troops at San Carlos. A very sizable chunk of the Argentine Air Force was sunk in the air battle, but San Carlos, which I showed you earlier on, became known as Bomb Alley. Such was the ferocity of the attacks there. And it's still known sometimes as Bomb Alley, and it's still where the main British war cemetery is. The British Army, just to kind of bring you up to speed, had then moved on to take Goose Green during a very nasty and prolonged battle. The people at Goose Green, as I said, I think in some ways we had it a little better in town, although that would change. But those people who are on some of the isolated sheep farms, such as at Goose Green, had been locked up for 4 weeks. in the little community hall. So at Goose Green, there were, I think, 120 men, women, and children locked in a place about probably half the size or a third of the size of this auditorium here, with inadequate cooking facilities, almost no hygiene facilities, while the Argentines ransacked their homes, and then they had a battle raging around them. So they had a terrible time. But morale was on our side throughout. The Argentines were having a great deal of difficulty taking this. By this time, however, the British Navy had closed in on Port Stanley, which was the ultimate objective. And every night, they would come into a point perhaps 4 or 5 miles off the coast and unleash their artillery on the town. And this went on for the best part of a month. So we would hunker down in the Upland Goose, where my family and I had moved, for safety, because it had stone walls about yay thick. So we figured that we were safe there. The rest of Stanley is very much in the Chilean sort of Patagonian style of building, timber with corrugated iron, so there wasn't any protection. But this place where we settled with our friends was relatively safe. And by the way, the Argentine clergy and journalists had taken over one end of the hotel, and we were down the other end of the hotel. So that was a very interesting dynamic as well. But the Navy would close in at about midnight every night and begin shelling Stanley. And it seemed to me that every night the shells just got that little bit closer. They were picking off defensive positions, and they had artillery observers to the north of Stanley on the mountains who could roughly see and direct the shells. But it was an uncomfortable situation, and that went on for, as I say, the best part of a month. Nadia my wife was reminding me that I should mention to you, I don't really have the photographs to go with it, but the degree to which there was resistance in the Falklands, and certainly there was resistance. Those people who found themselves outside Port Stanley were able to link up with the British troops who were advancing, and either provide them with wagon train facilities, basically, from the landing point at San Carlos right up to the horseshoe of mountains around Stanley, carrying ammunition, carrying foodstuffs, and taking wounded people back. But one or two people, actually 2 people in particular, both of whom I knew very well, Vernon Steen and Terry Peck, were on that side of the lines. And they actually signed up with the Para Battalion, the Parachute Battalion, for those final battles in the mountains around Stanley. And they fought alongside them. And Terry became an honorary member of the Parachute Regiment. Vernon, who was a shy person, painfully shy and withdrawn person, wanted nothing of it. He did his best, but he did his bit. But he didn't want to have any recognition whatsoever. And then also there was my friend Trudy, who was working with the Paras, the Parachute Regiment, running these wagon trains. And one of the worst battles for Stanley was on Mount Longdon. And there had been weeks of preparation for this. And on the night of the battle, Trudy was asked if she would walk ahead of the convoy of civilian vehicles that were taking mortar bombs and other ammunition up to the front line, and then would bring any wounded or dead people, for that matter, back to a point of safety. And she readily agreed, but because this was well within range of Argentine artillery, there could be no lights. Trudy knew the terrain perfectly. I'll be seeing Trudy soon, I hope. She's still alive and well and doing great. And I was able to write her story for this book, which made me a very happy man. And she was given a pair of white gloves, and Trudy had to walk in front of the wagon train with her white gloves, indicating that way or that way. So it went at a snail's pace, but eventually found its way to the start line for the Battle of Mount Longdon. And then, which I think affected her badly, she was stationed at the evacuation point for the wounded people, and she had to then work to get them back to the field hospital at a place called Estancia. Trudy was never recognized for anything, and her courage absolutely staggers me. She was remarkable, but she never got any official recognition whatsoever, which is always the case, I suspect, in situations like that. So once those battles had been achieved, the British troops pushed on into the outskirts of Stanley, where they were told to wait. My friend Peter and I decided there was a stressful period of about a day almost, during which British troops were at the west end of Stanley, waiting for the green light to go into the town, and the Argentines were on the other side. And there was still some shelling going on, but it had become quiet, and the end became fairly obvious. And Peter and I decided that we would walk across no man's land and see if we could see the guys and meet them and say hello. And in actual fact, one of the first people we met was our friend Terry Peck, the former chief of police who I spoke about earlier, who had joined the Paras. But these guys, when you saw them, you realized how much better troops they were. These were tough, well-trained guys who, I was going to say they wouldn't take prisoners, but they certainly would. But, you know, they were tough. Nothing was going to stop them. And they had fought their way to the very edge of Stanley. And then the next day, they began moving in. And you have to remember that although I've just been speaking for 40 minutes, near enough, they had spent the last 6 or 7 weeks with minimal shelter, fighting battles where necessary, out in the rural wasteland of the Falkland Islands. And a little word about the technical side of these photographs. I hadn't even seen them in 40 years. I took them, but such was my enthusiasm to process them, I got it wrong. And I put these quite valuable pictures in the developing tank with the wrong mixture, and they came out so faint, so flat that you couldn't pick out any detail. But I thought, well, I'm not going to throw them away. I'll hang on to them. So I did for 40 years. And 3 years ago, I took them to a studio in London, and I said, I don't know if you can do anything with these. And he said, if there is an image, the detail is in there somewhere. So with using modern digital technology, they were able to bring these photos, frankly, to life. And that was the first time I'd seen these images for almost 40 years. So these pictures came back from the dead, really. Stanley, my hometown, had been absolutely ransacked. During the final battles for the mountains around Stanley, the Argentines had been pulling back and enforcing themselves in town and wrecking the place in the process. For us, we felt the most dangerous point at all, because discipline was beginning to break down. In fact, only about a week ago, I was speaking to a gentleman called General Mike Rose, who had a role to play much later in life in the Balkans, but at that time he was leading the British SAS. And he was telling me that they were as concerned as we were. They were on the outskirts of town, and they were preparing for a house-to-house battle to take Port Stanley, but at the same time, they were carrying out a PSYOPS, a psychological operation, to convince the Argentines to give up. Because I said to him, I think if you'd come in, you wouldn't have had too much concern for us, would you? And he said, no, frankly, we wouldn't. We would have just gone house to house, and you guys would have been in serious trouble. But he convinced the Argentines that they should give up, or they convinced the Argentines that they should give up. And they did in the nick of time, both from their point of view and for ours, and from the British point of view. But that was the scale of the destruction in town. And as I say, the shells had just been getting closer and closer. And we got off unbelievably lightly. The civilians had been sensible, and we had all withdrawn into a little corner of the town, which was the original one, built of stone, and relatively safe. And while nobody felt terribly safe, we knew we were safer than they were on the outskirts. And one household in particular refused to move, And sure enough, their house was hit by a shell, and 3 of them died in that particular incident. On that night, the night when that shell was hit, as I think I mentioned, the Argentine clergy, journalists, plus a few of their staff officers were living in one end of our hotel while we were occupying the other, and never the twain should meet. Except that night, I was in the porch by the entrance, listening to the shelling and watching the shelling as well, and keeping a low profile. And this Argentine officer stumbled in the door. He sort of fell in the door, didn't see me. And I said something like, "Good evening," or "Buenas noches." And he was absolutely startled out of his uniform. But I had a bottle of whiskey, and I, as my mum and dad are no longer around, it's safe to admit it, I think probably we were drinking a bit more than we should have been. And that night I had a flask of whiskey, and he was so clearly shaken that I offered him some whiskey. And he took a big slug and handed it back to me. And we sat there talking philosophically about it for a little while, and he said that he had just been trying to clear the bodies away from this house which was hit. And 2 days later, after the surrender, I was back at the hotel, clearing all my things away, when my aunt, who ran the hotel with her husband, said to me, "A Major Hidalgo has just been back looking for you." So I thought, at this point, prisoners of war were being rounded up, but they were, the officers at least, were still free to wander a bit, and they were in fact helping to round up their troops, and they were allowed to keep their sidearms, which says something. And so I went upstairs to where Hidalgo had been, or was in fact, knocked on the door, and he said to me that he wanted to see me because he had to give away his sidearm, he had to surrender his gun. So he said, "Look, I'd rather you had it than somebody else got it, because you were at least decent to me that night out in the front of the hotel." And so he carefully emptied the magazine, I might add, and gave me his Colt 45. And then we both went our separate ways. And I occasionally crossed my mind that maybe I should try and find out where he is now. But, you know, sometimes you meet people, ships in the night, they can be important meetings in your life, but you don't need to go back to them. So I kept that pistol, actually. I still know where it is. Obviously, nobody was allowed to keep weapons afterwards, but I happen to know where it is. I haven't got it, I hasten to add, but I know where it was got rid of, let's say. So the move then became an important humanitarian one, to get these 10,000 or so prisoners of war out of the freezing cold and back to Argentina. Argentina at first wouldn't take them because clearly they wanted their public to think that the war was still being conducted, that Argentina was still fighting. But here was the evidence. We had about 10,000 Argentine prisoners of war who had to be got back, because you had 10,000 Argentines, 10,000 or so Brits, about 2,000 islanders in a town that was designed for about 1,500. And there was inadequate food, inadequate shelter, inadequate water. By that time, the electricity had broken down. The sewage system had broken down, and we were, it was dangerous. And so they were shipped back on the same ships that brought the British troops. They were shipped back to Puerto Madryn, where we will be going. And that was a bit tense. The authorities in Puerto Madryn were not happy to see these ships on the horizon, but they had to take it. I'll just go back a little bit and tell you a story as well about the resistance in town. Some people found themselves in happy situations where they could sabotage Argentine vehicles. Some of the mechanics working for the local government stayed on, and they would subtly damage the vehicles that had been taken over by the Argentines. And the electrical engineers who ran our electrical distribution system were particularly clever, because they kept the power going, although it would get knocked out periodically and we'd have long periods without power, but they kept it going on the whole. But there were power cuts, and the Argentine colonel who was in charge of that side of the infrastructure called them in one day, and he said, "This has got to stop. These power stoppages must not happen. And the electrical engineer guys, Les in particular, who I knew very well, he said, look, it's not our fault. You've got about 10,000 people here in a town that's designed for about 1,500, and you're just creating too much demand on the system. So in desperation, the colonel, a guy called Colonel Hidalgo said to Les and his colleague, look, if my men are using too much electricity, I'm going to give you an armed guard, and you go around to the various bases, and if you see anything using a lot of electricity, such as an electric kettle or an electric stove, you cut the cables, okay? You have my authority, and these men will protect you, and that will reduce demand. So these two locals looked at each other with a sense of amazement, and off they went, cutting the cables of the occupying Argentine forces with their electric kettles and their stoves and so on and so forth. And the truth was that, in fact, they were causing the power cuts in the first place, because they were replacing the fuses in the main distribution centers with much lower fuses, so they were just popping the whole time and, causing chaos. But, years later, Les, the electrical engineer, was still laughing about this. He couldn't believe his luck. So, inevitably almost, this was another phase. By this time, I'd managed to secure from some color film from the British Army photographers that arrived in Port Stanley. So I bummed a load of Kodachrome off them, or Ektachrome, I can't remember. And I carried on photographing. But it struck me as interesting then and now that it had been a black and white war for me, but now the piece was in color. And of course, along as many men died at sea as died on land and went down with their ships, in some cases. So all of this had really raged around Falkland Islanders, including on the farms. This was taken on Pebble Island, where the Argentines had an air base with ground attack Pucará aircraft, and it became the subject of a raid, an SAS raid. Griff Evans, this gentleman here, who I knew very well, his family and all the other workers on the sheep farm were locked up in a house for a month, and that particular raid happened around them. And this little Beechcraft trainer aircraft, ground attack aircraft, was later found in Griff's back garden, and he said, "This is my plane, I'm keeping it, it's my souvenir." But I think somebody came along and took it away from him in the end. And then inevitably the great and the good began to arrive, and I'm not going to be too cynical about it. It was meat and potatoes for me. I was back running my little newspaper, but actually it became a different time for me because I was one of the few people who could take photographs and write in the Falklands, and I suddenly became extremely popular in Fleet Street. So I was writing for the Times, the Sunday Times, Daily Mail, the Guardian a bit, and the Press Association. So suddenly I was in business, and I was off to the races. And I was starting to enjoy this time when there was actually plenty to write about and photograph. John Nott, who died fairly recently, was the defense minister who said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thatcher, it can't be done." He turned up. He was still defense secretary. To be fair, I interviewed John Nott years later, and he said to me, "You have to understand that my main concern at the time was not the Falklands, but the Russians. And we had limited money, and we had to invest it in submarines. We just couldn't waste money on things that weren't going to win the Cold War, or the Cold War if it turned hot." And Thatcher, of course, arrived as well. I managed to interview her a number of times, and she was an interesting woman. Everybody has their opinion about Mrs. Thatcher, and I'm not going to go there. But the visitors all went home, and gradually we were forgotten again. But, it wasn't that easy. The local people had to continue with their lives. Joe Etheridge here on the left, great character. Seen here repairing his property after somebody had rolled through it with some piece of armor. And Neil Watson, taken some years later, who was never the same again, actually. And he was a very embittered man. and I asked him if he had any physical reminders of the occupation, and he went out to his shed and produced this Argentine helmet. As I've written there, the war created heroes on both sides, and I want to be fair, because I think that while conflicts can bring the worst out, they can also bring the best out. So Brigadier Carlos Bloomer-Reeve had actually served in the Falklands. Do you remember I said that the Argentine Air Force provided an air link between the Argentine mainland and the Falklands? Well, Bloomer-Reeve had been the manager of that little air service, and he ran an office in Port Stanley for several years when times were peaceful, and he made a lot of friends, and he was a good friend of my parents. The Argentines put him back in as the chief of staff to the new Argentine governor, Menendez, and Carlos Bloomer-Reeve made it his business to try and look after the islanders in as much as possible. So whenever there was a dangerous situation with the Argentine forces, Bloomer-Reeve would move in as much as to do whatever he could. The particularly nasty man in charge of the intelligence operation in the Falklands, who we knew was dangerous because he was beating people up, was shipped out by Carlos Bloomer-Reeve. Bloomer-Reeve said he didn't have much time for intelligence people. He told me, he said, the intelligence people, they think they know everything, but they're completely useless. Which I'm not sure if it's true or not, but he didn't like them. And so he shipped this Argentine of Irish descent out of the Falklands, and that made us all feel a lot safer. When my father realized I'd been arrested on the occasion I spoke about earlier, he managed to get a message to Bloomer-Reeve. By that time, I'd blagged my way out of it, but Bloomer-Reeve was trying to help me as well. And on the British side, this is a man I came to know very well, Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly. He had the disconcerting habit of calling me darling every time we met. But he treated at his field hospital both Argentines and Brits and received medals from both sides. A wonderful guy. So that's all I have to share with you. 2 years ago, I went back to the Falklands and looked at the places where I'd taken photos in '82 and looked at them now and took some photos and wrote this article for one of the newspapers in the UK. And of course, the islands are totally different. And I've written a couple of books about it as well. I should be a good salesman, hold them up, and tell you that these books are available in the shop, the gift shop, up on the 6th floor. I've only put a few copies of them there because that's all I was able to bring with me, but I will be getting more in Stanley. So if anybody is interested in them, they're in the shop, but maybe I might go there after this and take some names of anybody else who wants to buy copies. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I've run out of time.